Welcome to the HR Empowerment Podcast, where we will uncover strategies and new insights from HR professionals who discuss up-to-date regulations, best practices, and the most pressing topics like diversity and equity, leadership, dealing with difficult situations, and much more that affect your bottom line and business. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, and welcome to How to Handle Conflict. I'm communication and leadership skills expert Pamela Jett, and this is episode number 3 of How to Handle Conflict. In episode number 1, we discovered that conflict is inevitable and that it is how we handle and manage conflict that can make all of the difference. And in episode number 2, we discovered what are the roots of most conflict, why conflict can escalate, as well as a few superpowers or powerful tools that we can use to increase the likelihood that we will make better choices during conflict. And in this episode, episode number 3, we're going to continue that discussion of how we can make better choices during conflict. Now, one of the things we talked about in our first 2 episodes is how conflict is inevitable. It's natural, it's normal, and that we can either handle that conflict appropriately, effectively, productively. We would use the phrase assertively, or we can handle it inappropriately or ways that are counterproductive. It might be handled using more of the fight approaches or the flight approaches, the whole escalating, getting angry, getting mad, being disagreeable, or ignoring it and hoping it goes away and sticking our heads in the sand. So both of those options, either the fight options or the flight options, are typically very counterproductive. So whether your tendency is to be more of a fight person or a flight person, or it depends on the situation in which you find yourself, there are some strategies that we can utilize as individuals to help us make better choices, to help keep us out of those dysfunctional conflict management strategies and patterns and into a more functional conflict management strategies and patterns. And before I talk about these tools, I want to give a gentle reminder that most of us learned our conflict management strategies based on what we saw, what was modeled for us when we were younger. So even if we've had good examples as adults, those initial years, those developmental years, very crucial in terms of our mindset around conflict. And we all typically have some dysfunctional tendencies. I know where mine are. I've spent a lot of time paying attention to, in what circumstances do I have the desire to cave in? And maybe I ought not to be caving in, but I still cave in. In what situations do I cave in? What are some of the underlying issues that trigger that caving in or ignoring problems? And then what are some of the underlying issues that cause me sometimes to snap or to become more aggressive than I would like to? I tend to, in conflict, be more of a flight person than a fight person, but I do have my moments when I'll go into more of a fight mode. And the strategies that I use to create some awareness for myself are strategies that you can use as well. So in episode number 2, I talked about how important it is to break the cycle, to sometimes take a moment to stop the escalation in its tracks so that you can make more conscious choices about how you're going to behave. And during that pause, and that pause may simply be slowing down the conversation. It may be simply saying, give me a moment. And you literally take just a beat or a moment or slowing down and just saying, let me think. And a very long pause. That's all the break of the cycle that you can produce in the moment. There are things that you can do when you break that cycle of escalation. And the first is what I call frame changing. And frame changing is based on one of the most basic psychological concepts out there, which is known as framing theory. So I'll explain framing theory and why it's important to understand with respect to conflict. Framing theory is simply the understanding that we as human beings are compelled to make sense of things. Share that with you again. We as human beings are compelled to make sense of things. So when we experience anything, whether it's familiar or unfamiliar, we need to make sense of it. We tend to frame it up. We tell a story to ourselves about it. This is our brain's architecture at work. This is how our brains are all hardwired. All of us tell stories to ourselves. Let me give you a classic framing example. Let's imagine your significant other sends you flowers. So you receive flowers. For some of you, the story you tell yourself about receiving flowers is, oh, my significant other loves me. They care about me. That's so sweet. It's a very positive story. For others, it's a completely different story. It's not, oh, how sweet. It's, what'd they do now? What are they apologizing for? Same event, but a completely different story. Now, where do those stories come from? Well, they come from previous experiences. They come from expectations. They come from, to some degree, how we view the world, our worldview, our values, our belief systems. So we make sense of the world and we tell stories to ourselves. Now, the example of someone sending flowers is a pretty simplistic example. But here's what happens. We tell ourselves stories during conflict as well. They said that just to get on my nerves. They're trying to hurt my feelings. Why are they being so rude? And we forget that that's a story. And that sometimes we are well served to change our frame, to check our story. So one of my very favorite frame changing questions, or at least frame awareness building questions, and this is something that I use, especially if I go to some sort of snap judgment in my head, like, oh my gosh, they're being so rude. I like to ask this question. And I don't ask this out loud. This is something I ask of myself. I'm questioning my own thought process at this stage. So the question I use is, how true is that really? How true is that really? They're being so rude. How true is that really? Now, here's the benefit of asking, how true is that really? First of all, it makes me acknowledge that I am framing things up, that I am organizing their behavior and trying to make sense of their behavior, and that there is room for my organization, my understanding, my way of framing up the situation. There is the possibility that I could be doing it wrong, or it's inaccurate or incomplete. And simply taking a moment to say, oh, maybe I'm not seeing this clearly, or maybe there's another way to see this. Right there is a moment where I am more likely to make a better choice. Acknowledging that my way is not necessarily the only way, or that my way of understanding a situation or viewing a situation isn't necessarily the only way. How true is this really? And a lot of times, like, oh, well, and I realize, oh, maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe they've got something else going on. That's one of my frame changing questions, and I use it a lot. Another frame changing question that I like to ask myself, and please bear in mind, you do not say these out loud. These are things that are going through your own head to help you make better choices. And this frame changing question is, what are they afraid of? What are they afraid of? We talked in one of our earlier episodes about how conflict that escalates into something that is counterproductive, poor conflict management choices, fight or flight choices, are fear-based. So what if I look for the fear? So I have someone who is flying off the handle and yelling, instead of thinking, why are they being such a jerk? How about, what are they afraid of? Now, here's the interesting thing. I may come up with what they're afraid of, and it's in my mind, okay, that makes sense. I could be afraid of that, and it could be wrong. It doesn't matter whether my guess, so to speak, is right or wrong. That's irrelevant. It's that I'm taking a moment to change my perspective and to realize, oh, this isn't about me. This is about them and one of their fears. For example, it very well could be that I ask myself, what are they afraid of? And I think, oh, okay, they're afraid to look foolish in front of their boss. So that's why they're being so stubborn. That's why they're sticking to their guns and not being willing to cooperate or collaborate. Or that's why they're not even giving me 1 inch in this conversation. Or that's why they're being so intractable. Or maybe that's why they're being a bully, is because they don't want to look weak. They're afraid of being taken advantage of. A lot of times when we stop and ask ourselves, what are they afraid of? The answer will be pretty obvious to us. And we're like, oh, okay. And then that helps us develop more empathy. And it increases the likelihood that we won't take it personally. We won't take it personally. We realize, oh, this isn't about me. And when I don't take it personally, I'm interrupting that cycle of escalation. Remember, we talked in our previous episode about how when person A behaves and person B perceives a threat. So if person A does something to me and I'm person B and I perceive a threat, but I can change how I perceive it and I no longer perceive it as a threat. It's not even about me at all. Then I'm probably not going to respond in a fashion that will escalate things. I'm more likely to choose a neutral or a very proactive, appropriate, assertive response if I can change the way I see it. What are they afraid of? Really a powerful question. Another thing that I like to do, it changes my own frame of things, but it also helps me to develop some self-awareness, is what am I afraid of? Because I might start to feel very defensive. I might just feel threatened. I might feel frustrated. I might start to want to dig in my own heels. I might start to go down that road where I'm escalating, or I might want to flee. I might want to ignore that problem or not bring it up or not talk about it or cave in and let them have their way just so that we don't rock the boat. Like I said, that's more my style. It's part of it was because of how I am, but it's also part of how I was raised. Don't be a nice girl, don't rock the boat. So I sometimes go towards flight styles during conflict. If I ask myself, what am I afraid of? Sometimes I realize, nothing. Like, I don't have anything to lose in this situation. What am I afraid of? That they'll disagree with me? Well, people have disagreed with me before. I survived. I can stand up for myself. I can engage in a professional, appropriate way. I don't have to take the wimpy way out. I don't have to give up or cave in. I can express my values and my beliefs, because that's the problem. Sometimes I might find myself caving in or letting other people have their way. And then I'm really feeling icky because I sacrificed something that was important to me, or I caved in on something that I really ought to have stood up for. So if I'm feeling that need or that desire to engage in a flight strategy, I like to ask myself, what am I afraid of? As I mentioned, I rarely go into the fight strategies, but sometimes I can. And if I'm tempted to go down that road, or even if I'm in that cycle, I want to ask myself, what am I afraid of? Another really good frame changing question you can ask yourself, and you can either ask it about yourself or about someone else, is, what is their ultimate goal in this conversation? Like, what are they really looking to accomplish? I can also ask myself, what am I really looking to accomplish? Sometimes my only need is to be heard. In episode number 2, we talked about how sometimes we will be in a situation where person A wants to go to a restaurant and person B wants to go to a different restaurant. So we've got some conflict over that. And again, they're not fighting over it. It's just we're in conflict, because that's what happens. You want one thing, somebody else wants the other. And we talked about how sometimes it's not really about the restaurant, it's about some goals around going out to eat. So person A may want to go to a restaurant where they can have good conversation, have some quiet time, have a slower meal, some time to connect with their partner. Person B may want to go someplace where there's tasty food and they want to watch a ball game on the TV, or they want to get home quickly because they have some other tasks that they want to do. So person A wants one restaurant, person B wants another, but it's really not about the restaurant. It's about their ultimate goal in the situation. Person A wants connection time. Person B wants entertainment time. Different goals in the conversation. So if I can ask myself, okay, what is my ultimate goal in the conversation? I can also then more clearly communicate that to my partner. Because remember, we talked about unleashing curiosity to be able to ask, hey, tell me more about why you want to go to restaurant A. Well, sometimes people aren't going to use those tools on us. They aren't going to say, hey, tell me more about why you believe this is the best option. They aren't necessarily going to ask those open-ended curiosity questions. We might have to step in and say, my ultimate goal here is for us to actually express it that way. My ultimate goal for us going out to dinner, or my ultimate goal with this project that we're working on, or even my ultimate goal in this conversation is for us to both walk away with a better understanding of how we can work with our two teams more efficiently. What is my ultimate goal? And then I want to express that ultimate goal, or ask them, what's your ultimate goal in this conversation? This conversation would be successful to you if. And that's another way of asking about their ultimate goal. Then another question I like to ask myself, and this is really powerful. This changes my whole way of functioning in conflict often, is I like to ask myself, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective? Like, what's more important to me right now, being right or being effective? Now, I will tell you that there are a few occasions where you can be both right and effective. And there also are a few occasions where being right very much may be your ultimate goal. But I like to ask myself, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective? Because most of the time, in most situations, I want to be effective. Being right is not as important to me as being effective. And I'm willing to sacrifice being right if I can be effective. So sometimes in a conflict, then I ask myself, okay, do I need to be right? And if I don't, then I can let it go. I'm using one of those more flight-based strategies, but I'm making an intentional choice. Making an intentional choice because the stakes are not as high. I've decided that. In conflict, which, like I said, is inevitable and it's neutral, it's natural, it's normal, it's how we manage it that makes the difference. If we can change the way we see ourselves and see others in conflict, and then use some of our superpowers like curiosity, like breaking that escalation cycle, if we can ask ourselves these frame-changing questions, we increase the likelihood that we will use good communication and good leadership tools during conflict, that we will make better choices around conflict, that we will use assertive conflict management strategies. This has been episode number 3 of How to Handle Conflict. I'm communication and leadership skills expert, Pamela Jett. You can find more about my relentlessly positive communication and leadership skills by visiting PamelaJett.com. That's PamelaJett.com. And in episode number 4, we are going to discover what assertiveness is and what assertive conflict management looks like and sounds like, so that you have the strategies and the tools to engage in effective conflict management. So stay tuned for episode number 4.
Thank you for joining the HR Empowerment Podcast, brought to you by Aurora Training Advantage. We hope you've gained new insight and strategies to navigate the HR profession. We look forward to you joining us again on the HR Empowerment Podcast.